Section 46 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 8, Chapter 2. Spheres of Action, Moriscos, Part 8. The growth of the absurd cult of limpieza brought another hardship of no little moment. At first there was a disposition to exempt Moriscos from its exclusiveness. When, in 1565, Philip II was trying conciliation, he ordered that leading and influential Moriscos should be appointed as familiars, and we have seen that Inquisitor Miranda gave commissions to the brothers Abenamir. Paul IV forbade admission to holy orders to the descendants of Jews to the fourth generation, and in 1573 Gregory VIII extended this to the Moriscos, but the Cortes of Monzon in 1564 had decreed that those trained in the Morisco College of Valencia should be allowed to hold benefices and the cure of souls among their people, and we are told that it graduated some good priests and preachers and doctors of theology. Yet in time the exclusion became general, and throughout Spain no distinction was made between descendants of Jews and Mudejares. In a land where a career in office, secular or ecclesiastical, was the ambition of every man who had a smattering of education, this barrier condemned to obscurity able men who naturally devoted their energies to stimulating disaffection and provoking revolt. Navarrete, as we have seen, even thinks that the necessity of the expulsion would have been averted but for this, that the Moriscos could have been Christianized if they had had the opportunity to identify themselves with the nation and to share in its public life, in place of being driven to desperation and to hatred of religion by the indelible stigma imposed upon them. The baptism of Morisco children furnished a perpetual source of irritation. Rigid regulations were prescribed to ensure the administration of the sacrament, as it was essential to their salvation and to rendering them subject to inquisitorial jurisdiction. No Morisco woman was allowed to act as midwife, but in every village there was a Christian midwife, carefully selected and instructed. She kept watch on all pregnant women, under a fine of 100 reales for every case she missed. After putting the infant to the breast, her first duty was to notify the priest and alguazil, after which she was not to leave the bedside save for indispensable household duties. The baptism was performed the same day or the next, and careful registers were kept, so that identification could be secured. There is doubtless truth in the universal assertion that, on returning home, the father scraped and washed the spots touched by the chrism, in the belief that he thereby effaced the sacrament. Marriage was the source of infinite trouble. The Church had prohibited unions within the fourth degree of kinship, and by inventing spiritual affinity it had complicated and enlarged the incestuous area, while by assuming for the pope the profitable power of selling dispensations, it admitted that the restriction was purely artificial. Among the Moors, marriage between first cousins was permitted, and as the Moriscos dwelt confined in their morerias, or in small isolated villages, without power to change domicile, intermarriage throughout the generations had created such complexity of relationship that unions lawful under the canon law must have been exceptional. We have seen the question raised in the Concordia of 1528, with the result that existing marriages and betrothals were dispensed for, but that future ones must conform to the canons. This was a virtual impossibility. The rectors sought to make their subjects purchase dispensations, but we are told that they rarely did so, that in some places they merely told the lord that the parties were of kin, and that, if he made no objection, the marriage would take place, an indifference for which more than one noble was prosecuted and publicly penanced. Under such circumstances there could have been no Christian marriage rites, and the union was legally pure concubinage, or at best clandestine marriage, which the Council of Trent in 1563 pronounced invalid. It was probably the conciliar definitions that induced the Cortes of Monzon in 1564 to petition that faculties should be afforded for obtaining dispensations from the commissioner of the Santa Cruzada, who possessed the requisite faculties, and further that the offspring of such unions should be legally legitimate. To this not unreasonable request the bishops of the Council of Valencia, in 1565, replied by threatening excommunication and other penalties on all marrying within the prohibited degrees, and on all concerned in evasions of the canons. The matter was universally admitted to be of supreme importance, but it was treated with the customary negligence and procrastination. At length, in 1587, Philip II represented it to Sixtus V, but he only obtained a brief, January 25, 1588, granting to the Valencia bishops, for 6 months only, faculties to validate such marriages, legitimate the children, and absolve the parents in utroque foro, with salutary penance, for all of which no fees were to be exacted. It is not likely that the officials took much interest in performing this gratuitous labor, or that the Moriscos, even if they chanced to hear of the brief, exposed themselves to the annoyances which it entailed. The last recorded action in the matter is that Philip, in 1595, resolved to apply for another brief of the same nature. He doubtless obtained it with the same nugatory result. The Moorish rule to eat no meat slaughtered by the uncircumcised was made the pretext for some troublesome intermeddling. In the Granada decree of 1526, Charles V forbade all slaughtering by Moriscos in places where there was an Old Christian. Where there was none, the priest was to designate a person to perform the office. Little attention appears to have been paid to the matter until Archbishop Ribera issued an edict prohibiting Moriscos from eating meat that had not been slaughtered by an Old Christian. This was trespassing on the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, and in 1579 the Suprema called upon the Valencia tribunal for a report, including what Bishop Gallo of Orihuela had done with regard to the same matter. The tribunal replied that the edict was obeyed, but that the Moriscos would eat no meat slaughtered by Old Christians, except in a few places, under compulsion, by their lords. The edict ought to be perpetuated, for the refusal to eat the meat of a Christian butcher was proof of suspicion, requiring prosecution by the Inquisition. In Orihuela there was doubt whether a cow killed at Aspe had been properly slaughtered. The Moriscos refused to eat of it, for which the Murcia tribunal punished a number of them, leading Bishop Gallo to order that, at Aspe and Nobelda, the butchering should be done by Old Christians. It was probably this which led to general legislation forbidding Moriscos to follow the trade of butchers, or even to kill a fowl for a sick man, a law repeated as late as 1595. Subjected to the perpetual exasperation of interference with their habits and customs, to the oppression of their lords and the persecution of the Inquisition, denied all opportunity to rise in the social scale, forbidden to enjoy the faith of their ancestors, while sedulously trained to hate the religion imposed on them, and despairing of relief in the future, it is no wonder that the Moriscos were discontented subjects, eager to throw off the insupportable yoke and to rise against their oppressors. They were, however, but a little more than 500,000 of souls, weaponless and untrained, in a population of 8 or 10 millions, a negligible quantity in the vigorous days of Ferdinand and even in the earlier years of Charles V. The Spanish monarchy, however, had squandered its strength in distant enterprises, even before the fearful drain in the Netherlands. The exhaustive effort required to crush the Moriscos of Granada showed that it was already bankrupt in resources. That episode was a warning which Spanish statesmanship might well take to heart, and year by year the fear grew greater of what might be the fate of Spain if internal enemies should unite with external. There had been long a source of humiliation and annoyance, though not in itself of danger, in the ravages of Moorish corsairs along the southern coast, for which the Moriscos were held responsible. Undoubtedly they aided by conveying information, maintaining relations with Barbary, and availing themselves of the razzias to escape thither when they could, but the primary fault lay in the incredible fatuity of a policy so preoccupied with foreign ambitions and the fatal Burgundian inheritance that it neglected the protection of the Spanish shores, until it became a proverb that these were the Indies of the Turkish and Moorish sea rovers. Complaints of these ravages commence with the Christianization of Granada and continue uninterruptedly for more than a century, while the measures to guard against these attacks were spasmodic and miserably insufficient. Boronat gives a list of 33 descendants, between 1528 and 1584, but this cannot include the innumerable landings from small vessels to carry away bands of Moriscos and such pillage as could hastily be gathered. Little raids such as that picturesquely described by the Cervantes, with its characteristic feature of the fortified church, in which the Christians of the seacoast village defended themselves, while the Moriscos eagerly hurried to embark. In the larger expeditions the Moriscos sometimes escaped in considerable numbers. In 1559 Dragut carried off 2,500. In 1570 all those of Palmera were taken. In 1584 an Algerine fleet removed 2,300, and the next year another fleet took away the whole population of Callosa, all of which was exceedingly damaging to the lords who lost their vassals. These raids were practically unresisted and unavenged, for the coasts were unguarded by land or sea. Occasionally, as in 1519, we hear of a few hundred troops sent, when news was received of an expected hostile fleet. Sometimes there were negotiations between the central government and the exposed provinces to maintain a force on the water, but the inadequacy of these precautions is illustrated by the bargaining in 1547, when the Catalan Cortes complained of the irreparable damage inflicted by the Moorish corsairs, and asked that 6 of the Castilian galleys be sent to winter there. Prince Philip would only promise that he would do what was suitable, which brought an offer that Catalonia would equip and man 1 galley, while Valencia promised 1 or 2, and Philip acceded to the request that the Castilian galleys should cooperate with them. Another expedient was based on the assumed collusion of the Moriscos with the corsairs, and it seemed easier to exclude them wholly from the coast than to guard it effectually. As early as 1507 Ferdinand undertook to depopulate it from Gibraltar to Almeria, but the experiment proved a failure. It was tried again repeatedly, in various savage laws to prevent Moriscos from travelling within prescribed distances from the sea, and from holding communication with the corsairs, but this naturally effected nothing. In 1604 the Cortes of Valencia even proposed to enlist the cooperation of the Moriscos by suggesting that they should redeem all Christians captured and enslaved on the Valencian coast, in return for which the rigor of the Inquisition should be relaxed and their evidence against each other should not be required, but it is needless to say that the plan was rejected. While this matter of the corsairs was comparatively trivial in itself, it bore a disproportionately large share in the discussions on the Morisco question, and undoubtedly had its influence on the final decision. The result indeed showed that there was a connection between the Moriscos and the corsairs, for one of the benefits derived from the expulsion was relief to the coasts. Vastly greater, however, in the eyes of the statesman was the impending danger of rebellion, coincident with attack from Barbary or from the Turk, or in later years from France. Even as early as 1512, Peter Martyr, in describing the disturbed condition of Granada, declared that if some daring pirate leader should march into the interior, the population would rise, and as Ferdinand was occupied with the conquest of Navarre, all would go to ruin. In 1519 there was a scare in Valencia over a report that the Moors of Algiers were coming to seize the kingdom, in concert with the Moriscos. It is somewhat remarkable that, when a conspiracy was discovered in 1528, the eagerness of the Valencia tribunal to defend its jurisdiction actually led it to protect the conspirators. The authorities had arrested Pierre de Alba and his mother-in-law Isabel as leaders of the plot. The tribunal claimed them as apostates and, when they were sent to it for examination, it threw them into its prison and refused to surrender them, although the viceroy demanded them as essential to unraveling the details of the conspiracy. Cardinal Manrique was obliged to despatch a special courier with a letter expressing his surprise, as the safety of the state was the first consideration, but even then the tribunal only gave them up with a warning that they must not be made to suffer in life or limb. When Philip II returned to Spain in 1559, he called for a report on the Moriscos, and the information submitted to him comprised an account of a plot with the Turks for an invasion. In 1565 a number of arrests were made on charges of treasonable correspondence with the Turk, and it was public rumor that 30,000 Moriscos were enrolled, awaiting only the capture of Malta to rise in aid of an invasion. The French ambassador, who reported this, subsequently added that the story of the conspiracy was contradicted, but the Moriscos were so badly treated by the Inquisition that despair might readily lead them to rise in arms to aid the Turk. In 1657 the trial of Geronimo Roldan by the Valencia tribunal revealed evidence of envoys from the ruler of Algiers with a letter urging the Moriscos to rise, together with plans to organize and arm them. It is true that the rebellion of Granada showed that there was no such eagerness to invade Spain as was apprehended, but, on the other hand, if, with the aid of 500 or 600 Moors and Turks, the insurgents had taxed to the utmost the power of the kingdom, what was the prospect if a powerful fleet, holding command of the sea, should land a heavy force of trained and well-armed fighting men? During the rebellion, the Venetian envoy, Sigismondo Cavalli, pointed out that assistance from Barbary would involve a kingdom in the greatest straits, for there were about 600,000 Moriscos to help an invader. So in 1575 Lorenzo Perulli, estimating them at 400,000, described them as the source of perpetual danger. The peril constantly increased with time. It was universally recognized that through the drain to the colonies, the external wars, and the growth of the celibate clergy, the Old Christians were constantly diminishing in numbers, while the Moriscos were rapidly increasing. The material and especially the military resources of Spain were becoming gradually exhausted, and Spanish statesmen looked forward anxiously to the time when, as Fray Bleda tells us, the Moriscos hoped eventually to reconquer the land with the aid of the Moors and Turks. Nor was this all, for, with the pacification of France under the able control of Henry VIII, there loomed before them a new and more dangerous enemy. Henry had a long debt of vengeance to pay, but was awaiting his opportunity. He was in alliance with the Turk and had no conscientious scruple as to Moslem aid. Even as early as 1583, while as yet he was only King of Navarre, there was a scare over an asserted combination between him and the Turk for an invasion in combination with the Moriscos, which led the Suprema, in January, 1584, to order from the Saragossa tribunal a report on all the evidence in the records as to plots for rebellion. This was furnished in detail and shows the incessant vigilance and constant anxieties, since 1565, to which the disaffection of the Moriscos had given rise, and their correspondence not only with the Barbary States and the Turk, but with the French Huguenots. A portion of the evidence was undoubtedly manufactured by the spies in the pay of the Inquisition, but there was enough of genuine to show that plots and intrigues were constantly on foot among the Moriscos. Henry IV was quite ready to utilize their disaffection in furtherance of his plans for the overthrow of the Spanish monarchy, and in 1602 he entered into negotiations with them, through the Marshal Duke de la Force, his governor in Bearn and Navarre. They promised to raise 80,000 men and to deliver 3 cities, one of them a seaport, and, as an earnest of their resolve, they paid to La Force at Pau, in 1604 or 1605, 120,000 ducats, but Henry decided that the moment was not favorable and the plan was postponed. Then in 1608 there came a fresh alarm through negotiations of the Valencian Moriscos with Muley Sidan, a pretender to the throne of Morocco, to whom they promised 200,000 men if he would bring 20,000 and seize a seaport, while certain Hollanders agreed to furnish transportation. Philip III was so impressed with this that, in sending the report to the Royal Council, he ordered it to consider the matter to the exclusion of everything else. He admitted the defenceless condition of Spain. Muley Sidan was its declared enemy. Sultan Ahmed I had his hands free from the war with Persia and had suppressed his own rebels. Spain's Italian possessions were exhausted and ripe for revolt, while at home the Moriscos were impatient for liberation. The council was therefore ordered to consider the means of preserving peace, short of butchering them all. This scare passed away. Muley Sidan rejected the Morisco overtures, and Ahmed sent his fleet against the coasts of Italy. The impression remained, however, the final impulsion had been given, and thenceforth the expulsion of the Moriscos was only a question of means and opportunity. Its execution can scarce be said to have been premature, for, although those of Valencia were deported in the autumn of 1609 and those of Aragon in the spring of 1610, Henry IV still relied on those who were left to aid him in his plans for the destruction of Spain. A part of his designation was an invasion by La Force with 10,000 men, trusting to the cooperation of the Moriscos, with whom negotiations had been resumed. La Force was in consultation with him, and was in his carriage on May 14, 1610, when, in the Rue de la Ferronnerie, the knife of Ravaillac gave Spain a respite. It was evidently supposed that the expulsion had been imperfect and that Spain was still an easy prey. The Baron de Salignac, French ambassador at Constantinople, wrote to Henry, May 2, 1610, that no matter how many Moriscos had been banished, enough remained to give the Spaniards trouble. War that elsewhere would cost a crown would not there cost a maravedi, and when it should begin Spain would find it more difficult to raise a maravedi than it would be to raise a doubloon elsewhere. As events turned out, these were vain speculations, but they have interest as showing how, in the estimation of her enemies, Spain had fatally crippled herself by the mismanagement of her Morisco subjects. To the Spanish statesmen of the time the situation had become one from which extrication was imperative at whatever cost. Section 46.